Hello and welcome to another video from the only channel that you need to not only survive the current apocalypse, but actually enjoy it. And today's video is going to be about circumcision. Circumcision is a very big deal. And the reason it's a big deal is because people want to be spiritual. They recognize they have a spiritual need. They want to fulfill God's requirements. And so as they're looking over all the gods that are available to them, they want to pick the one that's the true God. And no matter how logical the rest of the Bible is, no matter how loving it seems, no matter how much it seems to match the real world, when they get to scriptures commanding men to get the skin, the foreskin, cut off of their penises, then it makes God seem foolish. And especially when these people have spiritual advisors and they go to their priest or their preacher or their rabbi and they say, I want an explanation. Why is circumcision so important? Or why was circumcision so important? And the typical answer is, it is God's requirement, or it was God's requirement, and it is wrong for you to question God. This is just stupid. And this is one of the reasons I say you've got to get out of church. Almost everything they do makes God appear foolish, and he isn't. He shows incredible wisdom. Hopefully by the end of this video you'll see the incredible wisdom of circumcision, and you'll have a greater appreciation for God's Word, the Bible. Now, before we can get into a discussion about circumcision, we have to come to an understanding of law. And in this world there are really only two kinds of law that exist. The first one is natural law, the law that God instinctively put into every living thing on the planet. The law to humans, as recorded in the Genesis account, was that humans eat nutritious food, reproduce offspring, care for their surroundings. And these natural laws are the law that the Bible is talking about when it says God's law is perfect and God's law is forever. This is natural law. This is God's law. This is the law that is forever. The only other type of law that exists is called covenant law. The covenant law is a little bit different. Covenant law is an agreement between two individual parties. In other words, it's not God telling people that they have to do a certain thing. It is two people entering into agreement that one will do certain things if the other one fulfills other things. And just as an example, when you get a job, you are actually entering into covenant law with your employer. The employer may say that you have to do certain tasks in a certain fashion and at a certain time, and as long as you fulfill those requirements, your boss will give you money. And so that law only exists because both parties do what they're supposed to do. So if the employee doesn't show up for work, is the employer still liable for your income? Does he still have to pay you? No. It's covenant law. You do this, I'll do that. So if you don't go to work, you don't get paid. That's how we can understand covenant law. But the covenant laws work both ways. If you go to work and your boss does not pay you, then you do not have to work, see? Either party can break the covenant. Once the covenant's broken, it no longer exists. It is not up to one person to fulfill the requirements no matter what the other does. When Eve was created, she had in her this natural law we already talked about. She knew she had to eat, she had to drink. There were other laws that were not enumerated, like breathe. Now, some of those laws, all of those laws had consequences, but some of them were instantaneous. If Eve chose not to breathe, there would be instant ramifications from that. She would die. Now, God doesn't have to chase Eve down and put her in jail for not breathing or execute her for not breathing. She will die whether Jehovah intervenes or not. See, that's the natural law. But when they entered into this natural law, they also entered into a form of covenant law. Eve knew through this covenant that if she stayed away from one piece of fruit, that she would live in paradise forever. That's what God told her. He said, I will make sure you live in paradise forever if you don't eat fruit off of this one particular tree. Eve said, I won't eat fruit off of this particular tree as long as you allow me to live in paradise forever. See, it's a covenant, two-way agreement. separate from natural law. And it may have involved natural law, because we weren't there. We don't know all of the details. But see, Eve wasn't just offered that one agreement, that one covenant. She was offered a covenant by Satan. Satan's covenant was similar to Jehovah's covenant, but not quite the same. He said, if you do eat from this tree, I'll see to it that you live forever, or you will live forever. And not only will you live forever, but you can decide for yourself what is and isn't a paradise. So according to God's covenant, she had to pretty much stick to natural law, but by entering into Satan's covenant, Satan was telling her she could be like God herself, deciding what is and is not good, or what will or will not work. So if God tells them they had to protect the forest, that would preclude them from being able to strip the forest of all its lumber. But with Satan, the deal was that if Eve felt the need to strip the forest of lumber, that would be okay. So Eve broke that covenant law with Jehovah. Jehovah didn't chase her down and put her in jail. He just stopped giving her everlasting life. Satan, who went into this covenant telling her that he would give her everlasting life, actually broke the covenant with Eve. So Eve broke her covenant with Jehovah, who would have never broken his covenant, to enter into a covenant with Satan, who did break his covenant. I hope that's not too complicated for you. And aside from our covenant law with an employer that I talked about earlier, we all enter into covenant laws with, multiple parties, with a spouse, or with a government. Let's say a government has a rule that if long as you pay your taxes, we won't put you in jail. Now, if you enter into a covenant with America to pay your taxes, you won't go to jail. But you can't simply go over to North Korea and say, I'm in a covenant agreement with America, so you can't put me in jail, because it doesn't work that way. You can enter into a covenant agreement with this entity, but this entity may preclude you from being able to enter into a covenant agreement with another entity. This is just basics. Just basics. Don't get all stressed out if it sounds like too much gobbledygook. Now we're going to talk about how the covenant of circumcision worked. It's the reason that a lot of people think that the circumcision is part of God's law is because in several occasions when God entered into covenant agreements, he required circumcision. Now, there were times when he entered into covenant agreements with people where he did not require circumcision. So it's not that he always required it. So now we have to figure out why he required it. And to do that, we really have to have just a basic understanding of history. The people of Israel did not live in the same society we live in today. They had different standards of normalcy. And you can go online. I mean, if you're watching this video, you're online, so the internet is obviously available to you. But you can go online and type in the word circumcision, and you will find a whole lot of people that hate the Jews, or hate the Bible, or hate Christians, and they have set up web pages where they explain that the Bible is just a continuation of the Egyptians' civil law, because the Egyptians had circumcision. Now, this statement in itself is a lie, but it reveals something to us. Circumcision was not unique to the Jews, so we can look at the surrounding cultures, see what circumcision meant to them, understand how the Jews felt about circumcision, and maybe figure out why God required circumcision. First off, in Egyptian society, just like in, American society, say, a couple of hundred years ago, when these Jews were slaves, they were slaves to the Egyptian Empire along with other cultures that were enslaved by the Egyptian Empire. And in order to mark these people, the males were all circumcised. Now, they could have bored a hole through their ear, put a ring in their nose, but those are things that if the ring is removed or the earring is removed, eventually they seal back up. By cutting the foreskin off, they were making something that could never change, that would never grow back. And so that's why it was the best way to mark your slaves. But we're not talking about slaves to individuals like we had in North America. These were cultural slaves. They were the lowest caste within Egyptian society. They could not own property. They could not conduct business deals. There is nothing they could do. And so the only people in Egypt that could own property or conduct business deals were people who were uncircumcised. Now, an uncircumcised person in Egypt could still be considered a slave to another person. In other words, they get a job. And that's where a lot of the times in the Bible when you read about slaves, it is talking about employees. So anyway, knowing that this is the case, when the Egyptians or the Israelites left Egypt, they were all circumcised because in their life in Egypt, they were slaves. They went through the Red Sea as it parted, walked across on dry ground, and they entered into the wilderness or the desert. They spent 40 years in this desert before they came to the edge of the promised land. When they got there, everyone who had started on the journey that was male, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb, were no longer circumcised because they never practiced circumcision as they were going through the desert, even though it was a requirement. But that requirement was not for them to enter the desert. That requirement was for them to enter the promised land. Until they entered the promised land, it was unnecessary for them to get circumcised, and they got to spend 40 years being taken care of God just to see for themselves that God could deliver. He told them they wouldn't have to worry about shelter, they wouldn't have to worry about food, they wouldn't have to worry about water. All of that would be taken care of by him. And so they were, as they were crossing this desert, they were getting closer and closer to the promised land. Eventually they could see it, that it was a permaculture forest in the middle of a desert. Now, if God could take care of them while they were in the desert, obviously they knew he could take care of them in this permaculture forest. When they got to the edge, when they got to the Jordan River, they were told, you've got to get circumcised. This is my covenant with you forever, and with your sons and your sons' sons, and on into however long they were in this covenant. Now, people look at that, and the forever, and for as long as you're here, and with your son's sons and your son's sons' sons, that all sounds like everlasting law. That sounds like a law that God made forever. That's just in English. In the original Hebrew, it was basically, there's the promised land. If you want in there, you can go, but you have got to get circumcised. And the circumcision is forever. In other words, you can't get circumcised, go into my promised land, and then come out later and get uncircumcised. Because once that little piece of skin is cut off, it is not growing back. And there's a good reason for that. Civilizations then are just like civilizations now. They consume. They are consumerism. Our consumerism today is a continuation of the consumerism of Egypt, Assyria, Phoenicia, Greece, and Rome. It's the same deal. Everywhere this culture spreads, it cuts down everything alive. It kills everything alive. It converts everything in the ground, on the ground, in the air, into material possessions. These people were entering a rainforest just adjacent to the Empire of Egypt. Empire of Egypt, people worked all their life just to get a little bit of money. You could go into the promised land, accumulate a couple of thousand sheep, goats, and cattle, and walk them across the desert into Egypt and retire. But if you're circumcised, you can't do that. A woman couldn't take that stuff back, and a man who's circumcised couldn't take it back. You get into Egypt and say, hey, I've got a couple of thousand heads of cattle here for you. They're going to say, well, take your pants down. We want to see if you have the legal right to sell us these cattle. See, it couldn't work. And what about saying for your children and your children's children and your children's children's children? Same thing. You go into the promised land, you accumulate all these cattle, cut down all this lumber, dig up all this gold, and as soon as your son gets to be 18 years old, you send him to Egypt to sell it. So you see, God was just protecting his interest. This was not a mutilation. It altered their physical appearance. It broke natural law, but it didn't break natural law as severely as refusal to breathe air or refusal to eat food. There are arguments. Everyone who hates the Jews argues that circumcisions cause disease, circumcisions cause sexual promiscuity, circumcisions cause a person to lose interest in sex. All of that is foolishness. All that is based on is religion, which itself is based on hatred. those who are Jews, or those who worship Jews, say that the circumcision makes you healthier. The circumcision makes you not be promiscuous. Once again, nothing but religion, which is based on hatred and foolishness. The reality is, circumcision served its purpose. As long as that covenant agreement was in effect, circumcision would be in effect. But once the covenant was broken, it could be that circumcision was done away with. And every single prophet at the time when Babylon conquered Israel, every prophet announced that the covenant was broken. In no uncertain terms. It's over with. So does somebody need to get circumcised today? No. It makes absolutely no sense. It's done. There is no more circumcision. Now, what I just told you makes sense. I know it makes sense. I'm not going to ask you if it makes sense. It just makes sense. It's logic. If you go to church, what they tell you will not make sense. I promise you it won't make sense. So here's where you got to make a decision. Are you going to listen to reason, or are you going to keep going to church and listening to foolishness? If you don't want to survive, don't listen to me.